Okay, everyone, we're going to get started today. I am Don Coleman Lee. I'm the Education Activity Specialist for the Friends of Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and we are here for the 2022 Brown Bag Lunch and Learn series. And that series is presented by the Friends of Birmingham Botanical Gardens in partnership with City of Birmingham Stormwater Management, Jefferson County Commission, City of Leeds, Alabama, Stormwater Management Authority, Alabama Green Industry Training Center, Alabama Cooperative Extension System, and Jefferson County Department of Health. And today we have here with us Mallory Kelly, who is a resident of Selma, Alabama. She graduated from Auburn University with a degree in landscape design, horticulture, and graduated with her master's in horticulture from Auburn University in 2009. And 9 days later, after graduation, she began her career with Alabama Extension as a horticulture extension agent. She's married to Ron Kelly, and they have two boys, Hudson 9 and Coleman 7, that keep her very busy outside of her work. Mallory covers the central portion of Alabama, which includes Montgomery, Elmore, is it Autaga? And Lowndes as her primary responsibilities and coordinates the Master Gardener program as well as other horticulture programs for the public throughout her region. And without further ado, I present to you all Mallory Kelly.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'll share my screen and see if we can get that rolling now. How do you see it on your end? Is it coming through right?
I am seeing your notes, so let's back out.
Okay. I did.
Yeah.
Screen. Share. Oh. About now?
It's perfect, but you're on the slide about 10 reasons to grow bulbs.
For some reason, that's a good, I have no idea why from beginning goes all the way to number 10, but here we go. Okay, does that look right?
It's perfect.
Okay, good deal. Well, again, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about bulbs. It is a very popular topic with gardeners, and for good reason. There's lots of things that make incorporating bulbs in your garden a good idea. So we're going to cover some of that today. And it does say container flower bulbs, but most all of these, really every one of them you could put in a container, but you can also put in the ground. And we're going to talk about conditions that will help them thrive in those settings. Some of them I particularly like more in a container if maybe they're a little more invasive or they need good drainage, but otherwise they really can be put in both the ground in planting beds or in containers as well. So let's start off 10 good reasons to grow bulbs. First of all, they're very easy to plant, right? Much better than going out and buying that 3-gallon shrub that you have to, or large tree, you have to dig a huge hole deep and wide to plant in the landscape. So super easy, not a whole lot of digging involved, just the top few inches of the ground. And you drop it in there, cover it up, and you're done for the most part. So really easy to incorporate them. They require very little attention after planting, just continuing to suppress or pick, control weeds in the area, and then water if we go through a really dry spell. You don't want to plant them though in boggy, wet areas because bulbs, tubers, rhizomes, all the different structures that we're going to talk about here shortly will rot. So you do need good drainage. And if you have an area though that does hold a lot of water for an extended period of time, that's where a container would come in handy, or you want to build that bed up where it's almost like planting on a berm for good drainage. And then bulbs, there's so many different options available that there really are bulbs for all seasons. So we can do, spring, summer, fall, and then even force bulbs in the winter indoors, like our paper whites and amaryllis and things like that. So all seasons you can incorporate the beauty of these plants. Many of them are perennials. They're going to come back year after year. Some can be a little more finicky depending on our climate and whether you dig them up and store them in cold storage in the winter or not. That can determine whether they come back and thrive year after year. But that again is going to depend upon which plant you're selecting. Overall, they have very few pests to contend with. They're great for naturalizing an area if you've got just a space that you want to have some pretty surprise of colors that naturalize that area, but then also they can be incorporated into forming a very formal area, as well as growing them in containers, as we have mentioned. And they are sun or shade. There's lots of options, and we're going to talk about many options depending on the situation and the site that you have available. They're great for cut flowers and arrangements. So once they do bloom, you can go out there and harvest them and bring them indoors and enjoy them, most of them for an extended period of time. And there are thousands and thousands of varieties out there with all different types of foliage, colors, blooms. So lots to choose from. So those are 10 really good reasons as to why to incorporate bulbs. So let's back up. What is considered a bulb, right? The term bulb is used by most people to refer to plants that have underground fleshy storage structures. Only some of the plants commonly called bulbs are actually bulbs though, and we're going to dive into that here more in depth. The definition of a bulb is any plant that stores its complete life cycle in an underground storage structure. The primary function of these underground structures is to store the nutrient reserves to ensure that the plant survives year after year. Bulbs provide a good investment for your money spent. They can supply years and years of color in your yard. Just from that one individual planting, they're great little surprises to have as we move from season to season. And so now you're asking, well, we refer to lots of these things as bulbs, but what are true bulbs? A daffodil is a good example of a true bulb. So I have that picture here on the right. But what is a true bulb? A true bulb is a modified stem structure that contains all of the following. They have a shoot that is a complete miniature plant, including an embryonic leaf, stem, and flower surrounded by fleshy scales that provide nutrients, a basal plate where the roots will form from it, tunics, which are paper-like covered structures over the outside of the bulb that provide protection, keep it from drying out and from injury to the bulb. And then they have lateral bulbs and form the little baby plants so that you can propagate or more plants come up from that initial bulb structure. So that's what a true bulb is. It has to have all of those characteristics for it to be a true bulb. But then of true bulbs, there's two different types. There's trunnicate bulbs and imbricate bulbs. So a trunnicate bulb, an example is of a tulip or a daylily. Or a daffodil, tulip or a daffodil. An imbricate type bulb is like a lily. The imbricate bulb does not have the main difference is it does not have that outer tunic, which is that protective papery covering to protect the fleshy scales inside of the bulb structure. So these here, you want to be careful more so with them. They're not as hardy as trunnicate bulbs. They must be kept consistently moist before you plant them so that they don't dry out and become injured. And a lot of times people will store them in moistened sawdust in a refrigerator so that they're protected and don't become injured. So those are the two different types of true bulbs. Some other plants are oftentimes called bulbs, but are not true bulbs. And but they are bulb-like structures. Those would be more accurately called pseudobulbs. And these are structures such as corms, tubers, tuberous roots, rhizomes, and then even fleshy roots. A lot of times people will think they're bulbs, but they're not actually bulbs. So let's dive into what the differences are. So types of bulbs. This is kind of broken down into 5 main types, and it's based upon the way that they store their food. And so as we discussed, there are true bulbs. Some examples of those again are the daylily, I keep saying that, daffodil and the lily. But then corms, tubers, tuberous roots, rhizomes, and those fleshy roots are all not true bulbs. But let's discuss some of the differences here. Corms, first of all, a corm is a swollen stem base that is modified into a mass of storage tissue. A corm does not have visible storage rings when cut like you see with a true bulb. And this is one of the distinguishing characteristics. A corm contains a basal plate at the bottom of the bulb from which the roots do develop. It does have a thin tunic where it has that protective outer papery substance. And again, some examples of these are a gladiolus, a crocus, or a crocosmia. They multiply by tiny little pea-like cormules that form at the top of the corm. So that's kind of the difference between a true bulb and a corm. But a lot of times these are the main ones that get confused here because they look like a bulb, but they're actually just that swollen stem at the base where then the roots are formed. Then we move into tubers. Probably the most popular tuber you think of is potato, right? But a tuber differs from a true bulb and the corm by not having a basal plate at all from which the roots develop and not having a protective tunic covering. A caladium tuber has buds scattered over the tuber surface from which the roots and shoots develop. Some examples of this type of plant is caladium, oxalis, anemones, again, potato, and elephant ear. So different structures that are different plants that have this tuber type structure where they store their nutrients inside that tuber. Then there's tuberous roots. Tuberous roots differ from other root structures by the nutrient reserves being stored in the actual root instead of an enlarged stem. An adalia is a good example of a tuberous root type plant. A tuberous root of adalia should not be divided before you place it in storage in the fall, but should be divided at the time in which you plant it. And the root should be divided in sections with an eye bearing a portion of the stem left on each of the roots. So that's a lot like when we grow potato, like the potato, where we see the eyes form. But just want to be careful about that when you do divide these, when you harvest and keep them over the winter and then replant. These can be a little finicky. Dahlias can be finicky in our climate, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. Another structure that a lot of times is called a bulb, but it's not actually a bulb, is the rhizomes. And rhizomes differ in that they grow horizontally under the surface of the soil. On some plants, this type of rooting structure can be very invasive, so you just want to be careful about that depending on the plant. Make sure that you're not adding invasives to your landscape. The lily of the valley rhizomes, they spread horizontally underground and produce pips which develop into new plants. This plant is increased in the landscape by digging it in the fall and removing those pips, and then and the developed roots, and then replanting. Really easy to propagate rhizomes in the landscape. Ones that you're also familiar with, I'm sure, is the iris, canna lilies, gingers, and calla lilies. So those are all good examples of rhizomes. And then we have the last section, which a lot of times gets confused with bulbs as well, and that's fleshy roots. Plants that have fleshy roots store their nutrient reserves inside the root system, just like a normal plant would. Examples of these are the peonies and the hosta, as well as daylilies. Super easy to divide these types of plant structures. You want to dig up the entire plant and divide the clumps out into small sections when you do want to propagate these. And the daylily is best to divide it in the fall or the spring into small little individual fans. I usually recommend with the hosta that you dig it up and divide it early in the spring as well, right when you start seeing the new little pencils, as we say, poking up out of the soil is the best time to dig them up and divide them into multiple plants. So how do you choose the correct bulb? There's several things to consider here. First, we want to consider the site that you're going to plant the bulb, and remember they, ideally would be in the landscape year after year. So selecting that right site the first time is really important. First of all, think about what is your style. Are you trying to naturalize an area? Do you want it more cottage in form, or just different things popping up, kind of loosey-goosey, or are you wanting more of a formal type setting with a big impact? And then, is it going to be in a container? And if so, what's the size of the container? As to then how big the bulbs are going to get. You don't want just something that's only going to grow, 4 to 6 inches tall, planted in the middle of a container that is 4 to 5 feet tall. So you've got to plan out the size of the plant in relation to the size of the container. And then two, kind of that thriller, filler, spiller mentality of, something big maybe in the middle or towards the back, and then medium-sized plants in the middle, and maybe a spiller or something that's going to go over the side of the pot in the bottom. But we'll talk about size of bulbs more in depth here in a minute. Then think about your accessibility to water, making sure that you can keep them moist, but again, you don't want them to stay wet consistently, or you will have a lot of rotted material, which will decrease the thriving and the blooms of the plant, and then even just cause them to die in general from rotting. You want good organic matter in your soil. So that's really important, whether you're creating a new bed in the ground or if you are creating a pot mix that you're going to incorporate the bulbs into. You want to make sure that you have really good drainage with really good organic matter. Peat moss will help improve the soil drainage and add that enrichment to the soil. And also fertilize. And I have another slide on fertilizing. We'll talk more about fertility and what you need to do and how often you'll need to fertilize them. But they do need a good bit of feed for the production of that bulb. And then sun. Is it going to be in full sun, heavy shade, or a mix in between? Some bulbs need that full sun and some have to be in the shade. So it depends on the environment that you're planting them. Then think about the colors. And the combination of colors. Think back to a color wheel where you are picking colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel so that they don't really clash together. Here they're trying to make in this picture a impact of it looking like a river flowing through the middle of these tulips that have been planted, and it looks like daffodils as well. But think about that when you are planning out your color scheme. Are you wanting to go with really bright, bold colors, all of the same family of color, or pastels? And then third, the height. Again, this is really important so that you don't have the ones in the front covering up the bulbs in the back, whether it's in a container or a bed. Are you mixing them all together, or is it all just tulips? But then too, if it is just tulips, some tulips do grow a lot higher than others. So you do want to be careful in your selection of the different varieties and in their color schemes to make sure that they are all at the same height or the different heights that you're wanting to use for that impact. Let's see. So when to plant for our area, for Alabama, we're going to plant fall planted blooms that, plants that are going to bloom in the fall, or bloom in the spring. We want to plant in the fall. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue tied. The problem here is that these arrive in the stores usually now, late summer to early fall. So it's a little early for us to be planting bulbs in the ground yet. We want to wait until the temperatures start cooling off and the ground starts cooling off. As when you purchase these new ones, they've really already received their chill hours most of the time. And so they may try to go ahead and send up shoots if you plant them too early in the fall when we have an extended period of warm weather still to go. But popular bulbs you'll see out in the stores right now, tulips, daffodils, narcissus, crocus, hyacinth, lots of different options when we talk about bulbs to plant in the fall. So those that you can plant in the spring that will then bloom in the summer and fall, those really need to be planted after the soil temperature reaches 55 to 60 degrees as well. So you can plant them in the spring. You can plant them, but you can also plant them more in the winter. You just want to make sure that soil temperature is good and cold, or keep them in cold storage until the spring in March and April, and then go out and plant them. A lot of these are going to be more of your tender bulbs, so you do not want them to try to emerge from the soil. And a lot of times these should be dug up at the end of the year and put into a dry storage place away from frost or anything like that. That way, and then you replant them again the next year in the spring. So some of them can be planted in the winter, late winter, in the fall, but a lot of them you're better off to wait until the spring if they're really tender. So how to plant, we have some little tulip bulb planters you've seen, little hand tools that punch little holes in the ground and drop the bulb in, and those are fine to use, but then also just a shovel and a good pair of gloves on your hands works well as just the same. And the main thing here is you want to prepare that soil properly, that good organic matter. And then, you know, if you're planting a real formal bed, you'll want to select a pattern so that you can space them properly, and there's good look to the bed when they all emerge in the spring. At what depth? That's an important question to ask. Some of these you will plant a little more shallow, but for the most part, the rule of thumb is 2 to 3 times the diameter of the bulb. So if the bulb is 1 inch wide, you would plant it 2 to 3 inches below the surface of the soil. And also be careful that you do plant it with the root end down and the tip of the stem end of the bulb pointing up. The bulbs can figure it out. It just may take a little bit longer for them to emerge from the soil, but for uniformity in the bed, it is best for you to make sure that you do plant them right side up and don't just scatter them out like seed upon the ground, or even plant them upside down. You want to make sure those roots are at the bottom. Then you're going to water them in well. Again, you want good drainage in the soil, but water them in well when you plant them so they can go ahead and get that jump start, because they're starting to produce roots and all through the fall, and then we'll be ready as they've grown that rooting structure to send up those shoots in the spring to summer. Summer bulbs do require a great deal of water after you plant them, especially because it's really warm out. We don't get as much rainfall as we do in the fall and the winter to keep those bulbs consistently moist, and you don't want them to dry out, and or it'll reduce the production of the blooms. and try to plant all the bulbs that you buy in that season. Go ahead and find somewhere to put them. The longer that you keep them and try to store them in your house, in a refrigerator, or even in your laundry room or somewhere like that, the quality of the bulbs will continue to decrease. So make sure you do, all the ones that you purchased for that season, go ahead and put them in the ground. And you want to maintain most all our bulbs like a pH of that 6 to 7, slightly on the acid side. And a soil sample is really recommended. You can do that through Alabama Cooperative Extension. Just go to your local county office and they'll provide you with a box and a form and the steps to take a soil sample. And that way you know exactly what your soil pH is. So you can modify that by adding lime and incorporating it into that bed when you prep it to plant those bulbs in the spring or even in that container. So a little bit more on fertility for bulbs. If the bulbs are going to be maintained in a planting bed for more than a year, it is important to supply additional fertilizer. Spring flowering bulbs should be mixed into the soil in the fall. I recommend 5 tablespoons of 10-10-10 soluble fertilizer or an equivalent bulb fertilizer, plus 2 cups of bone meal per 10 by 10 foot area is just a good general recommendation for those spring flowering bulbs. As soon as the shoots break through the ground in the spring, though, you're going to repeat that soluble fertilizer application. Then do not fertilize in the spring the flowering bulbs after they have started to flower. This will tend to encourage the development of the bulb to rot and sometimes shorten the life of the flower. So once they're in bloom, no more fertilizer, but incorporating that fertilizer at planting of the bulbs, and then as they come up out of the ground in the spring is really important. For those bulbs that you plant in the spring for summer and fall bloom, you're going to fertilize monthly from the time that the shoots emerge until the plants reach full flower. That's about 7 tablespoons of 10-10-10 or again an equivalent bulb fertilizer, and then splitting that application up over 2 to 3 more applications per 10 by 10 foot area. So just know for those, you're going to be fertilizing a little more often, 2 to 3 times, as soon as you start seeing those shoots emerge. Continue to give them that fertilizer until they're in full bloom. Again, that optimal pH range is 6 to 7, and adding lime to the soil is what raises that soil pH, and that's really important for good bud development. And also a lot of people do like to incorporate bone meal into the soil when they plant bulbs. That's really gives the bulbs a good boost. And also blood meal, you can incorporate it as well, and it is what it sounds like it is. Blood meal and bone meal are both byproducts of the meat industry, and the blood meal is going to add more of a nitrogen component to the soil for the bulbs, and that bone meal helps with the pH range. So here is just a quick little planting guide that I threw out there to show you more or less the height differences. These are some spring planted bulbs that you may want to incorporate into your landscape, and just shows you on average. Of course, different ones can grow at different heights, but on average, the height that you see with things like gladiolus and dahlias, begonias, your lilies, irises that you would plant in the garden. That way you can get, if you want that cottagey appearance of talls and shorts mixed all together, you can do that. But again, if you're planting where you're only going to be seeing one side of the bed, you want those taller plants in the back, or the thriller in the middle of a container. And then gradually getting smaller as you come out from the back of the bed or the middle of the container. And then here are more popular fall planted bulbs. And this is showing the planting depth. So different bulbs do require different planting depths, and we're going to go into each individual bulb, just hitting some of the highlights on each one here in just a second. But do your research. A lot of times the tags that are on these bulbs will tell you how deep to plant them, but make sure you do check. Again, that rule of thumb is 2 to 3 times the diameter of the bulb. And that's also the rule of thumb we use with seeds as well, but it can vary depending on the structure. Like rhizomes, like irises, we don't plant near that deep, or you won't have the blooms. So you'll want to be careful and make sure that you look that up before you plant. So we're going to go through different bulbs for different seasons, and in there they'll be mentioned some of the characteristics you might need to take note of if they're fall or spring, or if they're tender or hardy, if they are a true bulb or are they a rhizome, if you need to dig them in the spring or the winter, things like that we're going to discuss as we go through each one. But here are some fall planted spring blooming bulbs that we can incorporate in our landscape. And first, alliums. This is one of my favorite plants to incorporate. You can have these in different varieties that will bloom in spring, summer, or fall, depending on the variety that you choose. They are bulbs or rhizomes, depending on the variety that you select. You will plant them in full sun. These are ones that they have to have full sun, or they'll just decline over time and will not thrive in your landscape. And you want the top of the bulb near the surface of the soil. So these, if you plant them really deep, the bulb will rot, and really the main stem will never emerge out of the soil. And these can be a little tender, so if you're going to leave them in the ground over the winter, make sure that you mulch them really well. Another is amaryllis, and these are one of those bulbs that we can force indoors in the winter. So it and paper whites, I would say, are the two most popular ones we see as winter forcing blooms. These do not require a chilling period, and you would plant this one also super shallow, with the top 1/3 of the bulb actually out of the soil, and not covered up by any dirt or the mulch. These you'll want to stake in the landscape, or if they're not in a really bright sunny location indoors, they'll fall over on you. So you want to make sure that you stake the blooms, because they're really heavy and require a good strong stem. And these can be planted outdoors. Even if you force them inside in the winter, you can plant them outdoors in the soil when the temperatures have warmed. The soil temperature is above 60 degrees. And usually they come back year after year with no problem in the landscape. Crocus, this is a spring and autumn blooming variety, depending on which one you choose, which variety. So you can have them in both the spring and the fall. And they bloom very early, can bloom very early in the spring or in the fall. And they are hardy bulbs in our area, come back year after year with no problem, not susceptible to cold in the winter, killing them, in the ground. And these do require full sun, and for these you would plant them deeper, that 3 to 6 inches deep. So you would use that rule of thumb based upon the size of the bulb. Daffodils, I would say this is most popular in Alabama, and it is a true bulb. So many different varieties and colors out there and available for you to add to your garden. They require chilling 15 to 17 weeks. So these are those that most of the varieties that you're going to be able to buy in the local garden centers they do require chilling, but we'll get that in the top surface of the soil here for what they require, but they don't require that much chilling. If they do require a lot of chilling, which are more of a northern type bulb, you would need to dig them up and store them in a refrigerator for them to meet that chilling requirement. Sometimes the second year bloom can be spotty. You want to trim blooms after they flower, and you can bring them in and enjoy them in a vase, but you do not want to trim the foliage. And that's really the case for all of these different plants that we're talking about. Those early spring bloomers, a lot of times people don't like them in their landscape because once those blooms are gone, the foliage is just ugly and yellow and spotty and can be an eyesore in the landscape. So you want to make sure that you put them in an area where they're incorporated with maybe some other perennials or hostas or things that also emerge and kind of covers up that ugly foliage. But you don't want to trim the foliage until it starts to really yellow and die back, because the plant's got to have that green, those green leaves to use for photosynthesis, so it can gather that energy it needs and send it to that storage structure in the soil for next year. Do we need to take a break for a second? Any questions?
I see one question in the Q&A from Hannah.
Okay.
She said, my Shaberti allium produced seed. Can I grow a new plant from the seed even though it is a bulb?
You can. It's just going to take a really long time for you to grow it from seed. And if there are other varieties too, there could be genetic differences that occur where the plant doesn't come back once it does form the seed. The flowers may not look like the mother plant. But if you can grow them from seed, but it's going to be several years before you're going to get some blooms from them. And I would look up, I don't know off the top of my head exactly the way they need to be treated. If they need, moist refrigeration through the winter months or something like that, that would be something I would check with before you go to a lot of trouble and then don't get good germination from them. But it is much quicker to propagate them from the root instead of saving and harvesting seeds.
I think that's the only question we have so far. So if you want to keep going, you can.
Okay. Yeah, I do have lots of plants to go over, and that's kind of the remainder of the program, is just talking about different ones and giving people different ideas of what does well in Alabama and what they can maybe add to their landscape to bring some interest and beauty. So we'll keep going. Let's see, my slide's not advancing.
Try clicking on the screen and then clicking the arrows.
There we go. All right. Did it advance for you?
It did.
Okay. This is Fritillaria, or also called Crown Imperial. This is a tall plant. It grows over 2 feet tall. It is hardy in our landscapes. And it's a very unique looking plant as well, as you can see from this. The bulbs, the blooms in the bulbs, though, one reason maybe you don't see it very often is it does have an unpleasant odor, but that does help repel rodents. So if you have a lot of issues with rodents in the landscape, this might be one you would want to consider. The negative to it is the smell that sometimes is associated with it. Bearded iris, I would say this is another southern staple. I think every southern landscape should have them. But these are not true bulbs, right? They are rhizomes. And there are so many different varieties out there, different colors, size of the bloom structure available. These you would be best to plant in the fall or in early spring. It's not ideal to plant them in the middle of the summer. And it's very, very important with ours that you plant the top of the rhizome at the soil level surface, really where you can see the top of that rhizome. You don't want to plant them too deep, or you won't have much development in shoots, and then a great reduction in the blooms. A lot of times the plants won't die immediately, but they'll just continue to grow and form more rhizomes, and you'll see those rhizomes will then form at the top of the soil structure. So just take a long time for them to get established and have a good bloom period. These are very hardy in our southern gardens, and it's good if you do mulch over the rhizomes just to protect them in the winter. But then you want to pull that back so that they don't end up being buried too deep as that mulch begins to decay and form into soil as we go into the spring. A grape hyacinth, these are true bulbs, and they are hardy in our landscapes. They bloom in late winter and early spring, so they're kind of in that same time frame as daffodils that we have growing here in Alabama. They grow about 6 to 9 inches tall, so they're not going to be as tall. They're kind of a good filler type bulb where you could plant something taller back behind it. They produce some do produce in the with some good spring color right at the beginning of the spring season. And these are also, like the daffodil, are good naturalizing type bulbs. All right, and then we have just regular hyacinth. These two are true bulbs. Lots of different options on colors when you talk about hyacinth, but these do require chilling. So you would be best if you dig them up each year and put them in some cold storage in your refrigerator drawer, would be best, and with some moist paper towels or pine bark or sawdust type mixture to keep them moist but not too wet where they would mold over. These do have a refreshing scent to them, so they do add that also to the landscape. And these you can plant depending on the variety in sun as well as shade. So if you have more of a shady garden, this might be a good option for you. Again, you want to make sure you leave that foliage up so that it can feed that root or the bulb structure for good production the next year. These are really good cut flowers that you can bring in and put in a vase inside your house. And successive years blooms may be shorter and smaller. That's something to note, just that the longer they stay in the landscape, the stems and the flowers can become much less each year the longer they stay in the landscape. All right, lilies, these are also true bulbs. Like I said, these are those imbricate type bulb structures that don't have the protective coating on the outside of the bulb, but they are hardy in our landscape, planted in spring or in fall, and many different varieties and colors available, different heights and sizes to them as well. You want to plant them in the full sun, and they do need a good bit of fertilizer, so you're going to want to fertilize them twice each year. Daylilies, of course, another southern staple, and these are not actually bulbs, right? These oftentimes, though, do get confused with bulbs. These are those fleshy roots that we have in like a hosta as well. They are very hardy in the southern landscape. They may be planted in spring or fall, and just like the name implies, they're a day lily. So they really, that bloom lasts for one day and it's going to close up and drop to the ground. So they're prolifically blooming constantly, and they do require a good bit of fertilizer to maintain those bloom structures throughout the year. Full sun or part shade, these will bloom with a little bit of shade on them, but I would say they're going to bloom best in the full sun. and they will bloom May through July. That's why we like them so much in the landscape, is the long period of bloom in which they can provide us through those summer months. They do need regular watering for them to really thrive successfully. And, you know, some of them, I'll say some of them will thrive even with neglect. Tulips. Now this is just in general the most popular bulb sold in the industry. These are true bulbs as well, but they don't do really well in the South. They're so tempting to go out there and buy them and plant them in the landscape. I would say they do best in containers, and the thing to do with them is replant them every year for guaranteed success. But best in containers, I say, because you can dump that container out at the end of the year or easily find all of the bulbs and pull them out and then put them in the cold refrigerator to give them those chill hours. That's why they really don't thrive here. The bulbs tend to rot more easily just because of our humidity and the amount of moisture in our soil. But then the main thing is the bulb doesn't get the amount of chill hours that they need. So digging them up and putting them in cold storage is going to be the key to successfully having blooms year after year. But most people that do plant them in the ground in a bed will just replant with new bulbs each year, which can be pretty expensive. The peony types are and some other species of tulips do thrive better than others. So if you are not planning on digging them up and you want to leave them in the ground year after year, do a little research and find out which ones are more successful as repeat bloomers in the South for your garden. So here are some spring planted summer blooming bulbs. You know, some of these can fall in different categories, but I tried to kind of group them based upon when their primary time of blooming are, or what we see here in Alabama. Agapanthus, another one of my favorites, like those alliums, they look very similar. They are true bulbs, and they can do full sun or some light shade. Where those alliums really need more full sun, the agapanthus can do a little bit of shade. These do need lots of water though, so take that into consideration. Plant them in a really good organic matter soil that can hold not too much moisture, but retain some moisture for the feeding and moisture of those bulbs. Fertilize once each month during the growing season. And again, they can be a little more susceptible to winter cold temperatures. So mulching them and then pulling that mulch back in the spring is key to the success year after year. Caladiums, now these are tender plants. They do really well in our landscape and they do really well in shade. They can take some sun, but dapple shade to more dense shade is more ideal for them. And really, this is not a bloom, right? We just grow these for the leaf structure and the different colors that are available in all the different leaves. Lots of different varieties out there. Depending on the variety will depend upon how much sun or shade they can take. If you are looking for some that'll do more full sun, you want to be real careful in your selection. Most of them are more for a shady environment, not for the sunny environment. Again, really tender. So these are ones that the tubers rot in the soil in Alabama because of the amount of rainfall that we usually get in the winter months moving into spring, that the tubers will rot. And so these are another one like the tulips, where if you don't, most people don't dig them up, they'll just replant with new tubers every year. But you can go out there and dig them up and save them, but you just want to be careful and don't rely on them coming back each year prolifically. Okay, canna lilies, another southern staple landscape plant, I would say, but with more of a tropical look. in its foliage and bloom. Many different colors of blooms available, different heights available for this plant as well. We have some that grow really, really tall, and some that I've seen at full maturity that are only 12 to 15 inches tall. So a great variability in the heights of these plants. They do grow from a rhizome type structure. They're very hardy in our landscapes. And one reason that we like them in our garden is because they bloom for a long period of time. You'll get blooms really all summer in the landscape. Crocosmia, especially if you like hummingbirds and you want to draw hummingbirds into your landscape, this is a great plant for that. I would just caution you that they can be considered invasive. So if you've got more of a naturalizing area where you don't mind them continuing to proliferate, this is a great plant for that area. They are hardy. They do grow from corms in the soil. They have that kind of exotic type bloom structure. Spikes of orange, red, and yellow can really be beautiful. And I know that I said they're invasive, but the good thing is that they're pretty easy to control. They don't have an extensive root structure where they're hard to pull. So if they started to grow into an area that you didn't want them to, you can easily go in there and pull the little plantlets and remove them and control them pretty easily. So not a reason to shy away from them. Just keep that in mind that they do like to proliferate themselves in an area. Calicasia, elephant ears. Again, this is just for the foliage, not for the bloom that we grow these plants. But at the bottom here, I preferred alocasia instead of calicasia. And the way that you know the difference is that the one that starts with the A are upright. And the calicasias, they hang down. And so a lot of times people refer to all of these as the elephant ear plants because they do look just like the ear of an elephant. These do grow from tubers. They're hardy in our landscapes. I have the alocasia in pots and containers at my house, and they just year after year come back, and they're beautiful in containers as well as beds. And they're not quite as invasive, or not considered invasive, where the calicasia are considered to be invasive. They'll proliferate and kind of spread all throughout a bed as well. So another reason I really do prefer and recommend the alocasia plants instead of the colocasia, sorry. These do like part shade environments. There are some that can do full sun, but you again want to check the different varieties. Some that grow 2 to 4 feet tall, and some that will grow as tall as 6 feet tall. So again, different varieties will provide that based upon research when you select the right one for where you're wanting to plant. Crinum, these are true bulbs. They are hardy in our landscape. They have that strap-like leaf structure to them. These are mostly are pretty tall structure with 4 feet tall, and pretty tidy in that they form those clumping type growth that the blooms come from. And these are also some, like the one in the top right you see is one that gets confused a lot of times, where people call wanting to know if they have the cahaba lily growing in their landscape. But if you see this plant in the ground in the dirt, then it is not a cahaba lily. They have to have water running around the structures of the stems in the development of that plant. So just know that that's a main difference that you'll see there if somebody thinks they have the cahaba lily growing in it and out in their backyard. Dahlias, this is a very popular plant that people want to try to grow. I would say kind of like with peonies, they can be finicky. Not to say you can't grow them in Alabama, but they can be a little harder to get to come back year after year. They are a tuberous root that you plant them by, and they're hardy and grow really better up north in a cooler climate than what we have here in the South. Wide variety of colors, shapes, and sizes of the blooms. They do need full sun for that flower production. And this is one if you do grow them and they're beautiful and you can be successful with, but you've got to make sure you stake them. As soon as they start producing those flower heads, they are going to lay on the ground, and the blooms will be covered in soil, and then also like the splashing of the soil up on the blooms really just degrades them quickly, and you can develop some fungal issues as well. So make sure that you stake them, and you'll want to divide them in the spring before you replant them, leaving at least one eye or bud on each one of the tubers. So don't divide them when you dig them up in the winter. You want to hold them off. Again, I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation, but wait and divide them right before you plant them in the spring, and make sure you have an eye or a bud on each one of those tubers. Gladiolus, these are corms structures that do great in our landscape, but they are tender. So keep that in mind. Great for cut flowers. If you want to put them in a vase in your house, they last a good while. Many different colors and sizes available, 3 to 6 feet tall. So wide variety and different heights. Full sun is best for these. And you can actually succession plant them. Once we move into spring, you can succession plant them so that you continue to have blooms every 2 weeks or so. So you've got more blooms coming behind the rest. Once some peter out, you've got more blooms coming behind it. These are also ones that you'll need to stake, or the big bloom head will be laying over on the surface of the soil. Dig up the foliage when they start to die back and separate the large corms, and then be ready to replant the next year. That's the best way for them to successfully grow year after year. Leaving them in the ground to come back on their own, usually you don't get good regeneration each year. It's best if you dig them up. And yep, I said that. Ginger, these are from rhizomes, and they are hardy in our landscapes. Plant in the full sun, they have great smell to them. That's one reason a lot of people like them. They will kind of colonize an area, so that may be something to take into consideration and just be mindful of. They bloom all summer and into the fall, and lots of different varieties out there, but good choice, good selection, very few problems with ginger in our landscape. This one right here I threw in, it's a tuber, and it is hardy in our landscapes. It has that exotic tropical type look to it, blooming throughout the summer. And this is a climber. So if you've got a fence or somewhere trellis that you would like a really interesting plant to grow on, this is a good choice. But you do have to provide that trellis system for it to grow on. Otherwise, it'll just end up, growing all along the ground. It'll grow 6 feet or more up, on the structure. And it is best for it year after year to plant it in a place where it does have a little bit of shelter during the winter on that root structure that's left in the soil. And when you plant them, you're going to place those tubers horizontally about 4 inches deep at planting. Spider lily, another southern staple plant. We usually see popping up around old home places out in the countryside. These are true bulbs, and they're hardy in our landscape. Really, you can do nothing to them and they'll come back prolifically and multiply year after year. Full sun, but they can also do some part shade. and they grow when in the winter. The foliage grows, and then they die back in the summer. And then, but all you see in the fall is before the foliage, you'll see the bloom. So the bloom stalk will come up out of the ground. You'll see the flowers, then it fades. Then the foliage appears through the winter, and then the foliage dies back. So that's kind of the cycle that you see with these spider lilies, which is a little different than the other plants we've talked about. Let's see, tuberous begonias. These are tuberous roots. They are very tender, but they are spectacular flowers to have in your garden in the midsummer. They're especially good for containers and hanging type baskets, more so than in the ground. Not to say you can't grow them in the ground, but they seem to do better in containers and hanging baskets. You'll put them in partial shade. They don't like full blazing sun. Really well drained soil. Again, I think that's one reason they do better in containers and baskets than they do in the ground. Fertilize them every other week, but keep the fertilizer away from the stem. That's just something important to know if you want to grow these successfully. Dig them before the first frost, and then allow them to dry with the foliage attached, and store them in a frost-free environment. So just a few little things to take into consideration when growing the tuberous begonias. And so with that, that's all the ones I wanted to highlight today. Hopefully I didn't miss one that you were hoping to see. If so, maybe I can answer some questions about it, but I try to hit all the ones that I know are popular in the garden centers, but also ones that can do well. We don't want to grow things really kind of the tulip. We can be finicky whether or not they do well in our landscape based on the environment. So hopefully I've given you some ones to think about and incorporate to add some beauty to your landscape and some blooms maybe where you're lacking in certain seasons. And then too, I just want to give a plug for our Master Gardener Helpline. If you have gardening questions of any sort or about any of the plants I mentioned today and you think about it later, you can call this 1-800 or 1877. It's a toll-free number. ALA Grow 252-4769, and Master Gardeners are available to help research and find the answers to your problems and get back with you. So thank you again for having me, and I hope I covered everything that you were hoping I would.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all those tips for the individual plants that I know that a lot of people use. And we have one question from Betsy Brooks.
Okay.
Is ranunculus good to plant in Alabama?
That's one where, I mean, I wouldn't tell you not to plant it, but you know, it's going to have a lot of finicky features to it. I don't know anyone who has had it come back and grow successfully year after year. Not to say that doesn't happen. That's kind of one of those also like peonies that if you find just the right perfect place for it, and you may have luck year after year, but do some research, see if you can find some varieties that are well more suited for our environment in Alabama before you put a large investment in them.
Do we have any more questions in the chat or the Q&A? Y'all can submit them either way. Patricia said, great presentation, thanks.
All right, good deal. Thank you for the feedback.
Dolly Walker wants to know, after daylilies bloom, should the stem be cut back?
Yeah, you can. With the daylilies, you can go ahead and remove them unless you're like a hybridizer who's trying to harvest seed and grow those from seed. I recommend that, you know, if you're going to propagate them, you propagate them from division from the foliage anyway. So don't harvest seed from them. Not to say you couldn't, but it's best to propagate from the stems. in the leaf structures, but then cutting back those shoots, those old spent flower stems is going to definitely help make the plant more beautiful in the landscape. But that won't take away from the energy working its way into the root. The foliage is doing that work for you.
Okay. And I'm going to allow Patricia Henderson to talk.
Okay.
She just raised her hand.
Okay.
Hello?
Hey,
Hey.
Patricia.
Okay, gosh. I had my question here. Oh, what is naturalizing? What does that mean?
Okay, that's just kind of when you think of naturalizing is where they kind of like an old home place when you see on the side of a hill, maybe where they're scattered about and they just are allowed to colonize on their own, where it's not a big, massive planting like trying to make an impact bed. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes, it's
More of a
Mother Nature's crown. Okay, my other question is, someone told me that putting bulbs in the refrigerator, they put off a toxic gas. Is this true?
Not that I'm familiar with, but like you wouldn't want to store them with apples because they do produce that ethylene gas
That's it.
and then
Okay.
cause the rot to the bulbs.
Okay.
But I don't really know. I could be, I mean, I just could not know, but I don't know of a bulb that particularly puts off that gas that would, you know, cause something else to rot or cause the bulb itself to rot.
Okay. One last question. You mentioned, and you showed a very pretty plant called a Crocosmia, Crocosmia.
Crocosmia.
Very pretty. Does it grow well in pots?
Yes, I would say it would grow fine in pots.
Okay.
It's hardy in our area. That was the one that's the hummingbird attractor. Is that
Yes.
the right one? Crocosmia.
That's all my questions. Thank you. Very, very good.
Yeah, it should do well in a pot, and then since it can be a little unruly, and send up little shoots, that would be a good way to maintain it.
Okay, and one more question. I took pictures of the computer of your slides. Is there any way to get a copy of these slides?
Yes, I'm sure I can send it as a PDF or a link over to.
Yeah, you can send me a PDF and I will send out an email to everyone. And if you're looking for your email for my last Lunch and Learn, my laptop actually just died. So I'm in the process of getting that fixed so that I can send out the last recording and everything to everyone.
Okay, are you on the second floor?
I am.
Okay, I got you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.